Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rose Shapiro. I am the Civic Education Fellow at the Washington University Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement. Thank you for being here today. We are going to talk about U.S. elections, some of the basics of U.S. government, and how the election process works, particularly for the presidential election this November. So to get us started, we're just going to talk about the levels of US government. There are three main levels that we talk about. There's the federal level, which is the national level. That's the president, the House of Representatives, Congress, the Senate, the Supreme Court. That's all on the federal level. On the state level, that's a different government within each state. It looks similar to the federal level in construction, but it has jurisdiction over the state itself. And then there's the local or municipal level that's the cities, the counties, the townships, which have their own powers and governing responsibilities. So when we think about US government, we think about three branches of government. This is common across other democracies, but in the United States, we call them the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. In the legislative branch, their responsibility is to create the law. So our lawmakers are in the House of Representatives and the Senate in Congress in Washington, D.C. That also is at the state level. Here in Missouri, we have a House of Representatives and a Senate as well. The executive branch executes the laws. They enforce them or implement them. That's the president, the governor, the mayor, and their staff and cabinet. So they're officials that have their own responsibilities and domains, such as the treasurer, who's in charge of the finances of the state or of the country. And then there's the judicial branch, which interprets the law and asks, is this law constitutional? Is this law allowed to be used, and what does this law mean? And we see this in courts across the country, but including the Supreme Court, which we are talking about a lot right now, as there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court. And so when we talk about the presidential election, we're talking about the federal level in the executive branch. And we're currently in the midst of the 2020 presidential election. So who can vote in this election? Well, that is US citizens who meet state residency requirements, are 18 years or older by election day, and they're registered to vote by their state's registration deadline. What I want to note here is that while we're electing a president on the federal level, the Constitution grants the power to the states to implement the presidential election. So each state has their own set of rules and regulations about how voting occurs. And that's why we're seeing a lot of variability across states on how we're voting this year, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. But even more generally about who cannot vote. So in all states, non-citizens, including permanent residents, can't vote. And varying by state, there are some people who are considered mentally incapacitated, are not allowed to vote for president. In the residents of the US territories are not allowed to vote for president in the general election. They are able to vote in the primaries, which are the elections that choose which nominee each party is going to nominate. And then by state, there are regulations about who can or cannot vote with a felony conviction. In Missouri, for example, those with felony convictions lose voting rights until the completion of their sentence, which includes probation or parole. And then afterwards, there's automatic restoration of their voting rights. But this is a discussion that is occurring a lot these days, especially in Florida, where there have been some changes and some debate around how to restore the right to vote to those with felony convictions. So yes, the states have a lot of power over these regulations, and that includes, now that we're in the pandemic, how we're voting this year. So in Missouri, we'll discuss the ways that voters can vote in Missouri. So the election day is the first Tuesday in November. It's November 3rd this year, and anybody can vote in person on that day. If you cannot go to your polling location on election day, November 3rd, then you can vote absentee until that date. So what that means, the polling location that each person is assigned based on their address or where they are registered to vote. If they can't be there, maybe they're working as a poll worker in a different location, then they could vote absentee, but that also includes being out of state or being out of the country, and this year it includes high risk category for transmitting or contracting COVID-19. So if you fall in that category, you can vote absentee. This year, there's also an expansion on the mail-in voting. You don't need an excuse to vote mail-in this year, and a lot of people are utilizing that in order to maintain their safety during the pandemic. But you do need to get your vote notarized, which basically means that there's a certified witness to your vote and who's going to sign your the envelope or the ballot that you're sending back in by mail. And WashU is hosting a lot of notary events this October on campus to help facilitate the voting process for the Washington University community. So that brings us to what actually happens when we vote for president on that ballot. So we're going to look at a ballot in a little bit, but for now, we're going to talk about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is written into the Constitution. It is it's very deeply enshrined in the Constitution, and it's a complicated concept and process that most Americans don't fully understand. So we're going to do our best to break it down today. First, let's talk about the popular vote. The popular vote basically means the votes that have been cast by all the voters. So all qualified voters, how did they vote? How many votes for each candidate? When we're voting for most elected officials in the United States, the popular vote would determine who was elected. Whoever got the most votes is the elected official. For the presidency, we have the Electoral College. So when all the voters vote in the election, they're actually voting for representatives or electors to vote for the presidency on their behalf. The electors themselves are selected by each political party in each state and cannot currently hold office. There are 538 electors, and a candidate requires 270 electors' votes to win the presidency. So we're going to break this down even further. The electors are representatives for each state. So each state has a number of electors. I'll show you on this slide. Here we are in Missouri. We have 10 electors, and we can see that there are as few as 3 electors in many states. It's the floor. That's the lowest number of electors a state can have. And the highest number is 55. That's not the ceiling, but California does have the most electors. The way that that's determined is by population size and distribution. So if you have more people in your state, you have more electors. And that is directly tied to representation. On a broader level and a broader scale. So in Washington, D.C., we have 2 houses of Congress. One is the House of Representatives and one is the Senate. The House of Representatives are representatives on behalf of states and more specifically on districts within states. So for example, St. Louis County Bowdish has a representative in Washington, D.C. that on a national scale is representing our interests. There is a different representative within Missouri in a different part of Missouri in Washington, D.C. So that is tied again to population size. And so the more people you have, the more representatives you have in the House of Representatives. The way that that is determined is by the census. We know how many people live in which places based on the census, and the census occurs every 10 years. And so on top of all the other ways that 2020 is historic, it is a census year, and we're just about to close up our census counting for the year. And based on those results and based on those surveys, we will learn how to redraw districts in order to represent the distribution of the population throughout the country, and that will impact how many seats each state gets in Congress, in the House of Representatives. The other house, the Senate, they have a different system of representation, and they are set up so that every state has the same amount of senators, and that's 2. Each state has 2 senators. So, the electors are determined by the Senate representation plus the House of Representation. So, for Missouri, we have 8 representatives in the House of Representatives and 2 representatives in Senate, so we have 10. So yes, again, the census is directly tied to the Electoral College and to the presidential electoral process. And we see that means that there are some states that are really large, like Montana, that have 3 electors. And here we have New Jersey. It's really tiny. It can't even fit the name of the state onto the state. It has 14 electors. So it really is about population. The way most states approach the Electoral College is that the candidate who gets the most votes in that state, who wins the popular vote in that state, they win all of that state's Electoral College representatives or electors. That's not true of 2 states, which are Maine and Nebraska. Maine and Nebraska, they split their electoral votes proportionally. So if one candidate wins 40% of the votes and the other candidate wins 60% of the votes, then their electors would be split to proportionally match that popular vote distribution. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but the other thing to mention about electors is this concept of faithless electors. So while it is encouraged and sometimes mandated in states that the electors vote in the way that the popular vote determined, there is such thing as a faithless elector, where an elector will vote differently than the popular vote in their state. There are fines that discourage this or other types of prohibition, but that does happen. In 2016, there were a couple of electors who voted for Donald Trump when their state had a popular vote indicating that their vote should go towards Hillary Clinton, and vice versa. So I will note, though, that has never impacted a presidential election. So no president has ever been elected because of a faithless elector. So now we're going to look at a similar map. This one again shows the number of electors in each state. It also names the states helpfully, but it also is very colorful. And so let's break these colors down. On this blue end of the spectrum, we have the Democrats, and this year's candidate for presidency for the Democrats is Joe Biden. He's running with Kamala Harris as his vice presidential candidate. And the Democrats are represented in blue. The Republican Party is represented in red. Their candidate is current President Donald Trump, and his running mate is Mike Pence. So we see on the map that there are different shades of these colors of the blue and the red. So if we see here, let's start with the blue side, this light pale blue in Arizona, that represents that they're leaning towards voting enough so that all of their electors go towards Joe Biden. So as long as the popular vote votes the most votes for Joe Biden, Arizona will send all 11 of their electors to vote for Joe Biden in the Electoral College. But this is the way they're leaning based on current polls. Again, this map is representative of the polling that's been happening, and that's varying levels of accuracy. So we can't know, these are only predictions. And so the way that it's predicted right now is that Arizona is leaning towards voting blue. Right here we have Colorado. It's a little bit of darker shade of blue, and they're likely going to vote blue based on the polls. And then New Mexico, right below it, this is a dark blue, and it's pretty safe that Joe Biden can count those 5 electors in his strategic planning towards his candidacy. So likely he's going to win those 5 electors, and that's going to push him towards that 270 mark. Right here we see, I mean, it might be blocked, I'm not sure, but there's a little arrow here. It shows that that's where they're trying to get to, 270 electoral college votes. On the other side, we have these different shades of red and pink. So Texas right here is this light pink. They are likely, I should say, they are leaning towards voting for Donald Trump. So they're leaning towards sending their 38 electors to the Electoral College to put their vote in for Donald Trump. It's very interesting because this is a very light shade of pink for Texas, and who historically would be much more in the red area. So we're seeing that more in this likely that Kansas is going to vote Donald Trump, as Missouri is also that likely category, that probably. And then these deep reds, these are almost guaranteed that Louisiana is going to send all of its 8 electors to vote for Donald Trump. It doesn't matter if 49% of voters vote for Joe Biden in Louisiana. If 51% of them vote for Donald Trump, then all 8 of those electors will go and vote for Donald Trump. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later and what that might mean. I'm going to move us over to an interactive map. Let's see how I can get there. Great. And so we can play around with these numbers a little bit. So right now the polling in this map is showing that Biden is leading Donald Trump in that race to the 270. Again, these are just predictions, and we don't know yet what will happen. But let's see what happens if, and I forgot to mention this interesting bronze color that we see here. And that means that those states are a toss-up. They are, we don't know yet which way they're gonna go, and they really could go either way. So I want to see what would happen and play around, see what happens if, say, Donald Trump is able to secure all of these states that were toss-ups, see how the bar shifts, and now he's getting a little bit closer to that 270. And what if he's able to flip over Arizona and have them vote red? Okay, a little bit closer. And then once more, what if he's able to flip over Pennsylvania and have them vote red as well? So now he's gotten to the 270, and he would win the presidency through the Electoral College. It does, and then let's see now if Joe Biden was able to get California or Texas to vote blue, to vote for him. Well, then he would gain those. He would get to that 270. So this is a really interesting way to look at what would happen and what maybe is going through the heads of the campaign managers and the campaign strategists for each candidate. So what's really interesting here is that if you were a campaign manager or strategist for Donald Trump, you would, or Joe Biden, you would be really focusing on these 5 states and a little bit Maine to try to get them on your side to secure their votes. But you'd also be looking at these states that are in the lighter shades of colors. How can I get more votes in that state than my opponent so that I can secure those electoral votes? So what happens is that they will cater to the interests of voters in, say, Pennsylvania, because there are a lot of electors here. There are 20 electors, and Pennsylvania, it's leaning blue right now, but as we'll look at it, we'll look at a map from the 2016 election. It voted red last presidential election. So let's go back to the slideshow, and we'll look at we'll look at the Electoral College in 2016 when Trump was elected president against his opponent Hillary Clinton. So Donald Trump won 306 Electoral College votes. That got him above the 270 mark against Hillary Clinton with 232 Electoral College votes. And we can see the way that each state voted in that election. Again, I'm going to point you to Maine, which split their votes. I think three electoral votes for Hillary Clinton and one for Donald Trump. And what I want to note here is that Hillary Clinton actually got more votes in the popular vote than Donald Trump. So about 3 million, a little under that, I think, 3 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton for president than Donald Trump, but he won the Electoral College by not an insignificant amount. And so it really points to an interesting dynamic in the system. What I will say is that this has only happened 5 times in US history that the person who won the popular vote did not win the presidency. But it did happen twice in the last 20 years. So out of the over 200 years that the United States has been in existence and who have been using the system, this phenomenon has happened twice in 20 years. So what we're really seeing and why that might have happened, well, there's been a lot of speculation about voter turnout and who came out to vote in the 2016 election. A lot of people were not excited about either candidate, but some people were really excited about Donald Trump, and so they were able to really turn out in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So Hillary Clinton losing these states really lost her the presidency. It's also interesting that the states that are really highly populated, like say New York or California, they might have had an overwhelming majority voting for Hillary Clinton. So there goes a lot of votes for her, but that doesn't reflect in the proportionality of their votes. They just get all 55 or all 29 for Hillary Clinton, whereas maybe, and I don't know the actual statistics, I'm just speaking hypothetically, but maybe in Texas, Hillary Clinton got a ton of votes, but it wasn't the majority, so Donald Trump got all 38 of Texas's Electoral College votes. So what it creates here is an interesting dynamic, one that candidates are going to really focus on the states that are more in between. So Illinois, and we saw this on this last map over here. Let me go back. Illinois is dark blue. It's probably going to vote blue no matter what. So Joe Biden nor Donald Trump are going to put much energy into approaching or reaching out to the interests of the voters in Illinois, because they're pretty sure how they're going to vote either way. Whereas Georgia is really a toss-up this year. So they're putting a lot of energy into making sure that the voters in Georgia are getting what they need to hear from the from the candidates. So it really begs the question, why was this system created? And it all was part of a compromise. So the founding fathers, or the writers of the Constitution, they were doing something really new in the world. And some of them were really afraid of the voters not being informed enough to make a decision about the election of the president, and wanted to have the legislative body elect the president. And then others, creators of the Constitution, were concerned that tying the legislative body so closely with the executive branch, that there would be too much power in one branch of the government. So they came up with this compromise where voters would vote for electors who would have the potential to bring their own informed view on the world into the voting process. So in the beginning, it wasn't intended as much that however the voters voted, that the electors would vote accordingly. They had a little bit more power or leeway, and throughout the history, we have created more of a system where electors are accountable to their voters to vote along the lines of the party that they are in favor of. And more states were set up, like Nebraska and Maine, where there was that proportional elector votes. But a lot of most states, all of them, except for Maine and Nebraska, have created their own rules, new rules that the winner takes all. So like we discussed earlier. I also want to tie the Electoral College to slavery in the United States, and how when the Constitution was being written, a lot of the creators were concerned that if it came down to the electoral process, to the Electoral College, and all of the people, or the highly densely populated North, would get to have more power because they had more people. Whereas in the South, I think it's approximately 40% of the population in the South were slaves who didn't have the right to vote. So how do we determine how many electors a state gets? That was another compromise that you might have heard of, called the 3/5 compromise. So the slave-owning states were concerned that they wouldn't have as much power, being fewer of them. So even though the slaves that they were owning in those states were not able to vote, they were counted as 3/5 of a voter in determining the electors, and also the representation of the House of Representatives. So it's noteworthy that Virginia, with 200,000 a population of 200,000 slaves, they were given 12 electors, partly because of that high number of population that were slaves, and 12 was about a quarter of the electors needed to become president at the time. So it really shifted power into those slave-owning states in a way that they wouldn't have had if it was just on voting population alone. So this system, even today, as we shift through history and have created new policies, is really confusing. It's really complicated. And like I said, many voters don't understand it or don't have a full grasp on it. And so thank you for going down this rabbit hole with me today. We're going to move on and look at the ballots in a moment. We're going to look at a ballot in St. Louis City. This is a sample ballot for November 2020. Like I said, each state is going to have a different ballot, and within that, each district will have a different ballot. So it's where you live or where you're registered to vote within the state or within a city is really relevant, because like I said, we've got these different levels of government, and the election is not just for the president. There are elections at all those different levels this year. So in this one, we can see that here's the ballot, the part of the ballot for voting for president. There are 5 federally recognized political parties that are on the ballot. I know we just talked about Republican and Democrat because our nation really is a two-party system, although there are other parties on the ballot. And part of that actually is related to the Electoral College. Why we sustain a two-party system is because we lose some of that power. I'm going to flip back a little bit between states to so even if 40% of voters in Pennsylvania, 40% of voters in Iowa, 40% of voters in Wisconsin, they're all voting for the Green Party across many, many different states. If they don't have the majority in any one of those states, then it's as if nobody voted for that candidate. only the winner will be represented in the Electoral College. So that's why when we look at maps, we see a lot of red and blue, and we don't really see much of other colors. You'll note here that all of these positions have a write-in option. You can just write whoever you want to vote for president, or for governor, or for state treasurer, etc. Again, I'll note that we've got the executive federal election. We've also got the state executive election in Missouri this year. We're voting for governor, for state treasurer, for attorney general, etc. A little bit below this is the sheriff or the county. So we've got a county election as well. Here we have a national election, or an election for a federal representative in Washington, D.C. for District 1 of Missouri, which includes St. Louis City. And so we're voting on that level too. But if you lived in District 2 in Missouri, you would see different candidates on this ballot. We also have a state representative election for District 83 in Missouri, which again includes St. Louis City, but if you lived in a different part of Missouri, you would have a different state representative. On the ballot, we also have some judges listed, many judges. The way that this works is a retention question. So voters are asked, do you want to retain this judge? Do you want to keep this judge in office? Yes. Or do you want to remove this judge from office? No. So no, I don't want to retain them. I don't want to keep them. I want them removed. That's what you would vote here. And this gives the voters an opportunity to remove judges that they feel are not judging in the interest of the people or of their interests, for example. But for the most part, they would need to get a majority of voters to vote no for them to be removed from office. And then finally, we have ballot measures. These are opportunities for direct democracy, where voters are voting directly on a policy. So this can get on the ballot in a number of ways. I'm going to talk about two of them. One, we have constitutional amendments. These constitutional amendments are changes to the state constitution and have been placed on the ballot by legislative referral. So the legislative body is wondering, should we amend this? And the voters are now going to vote yes or no. Yes for the amendment, for the change, or no for no change in the Constitution. So this one, Constitutional Amendment 1, is basically asking, so the governor and cabinet officials have term restrictions. They can only serve as in those positions for 2 terms. And the question is, should we extend those restrictions? Should we keep those restrictions for those positions and change that in the Constitution to make it so that we can extend those restrictions? The wording here is really confusing, though. If you look at it closely, it can be confusing to extend the term restriction. Do you want to amend the Missouri Constitution to extend the term restrictions that currently applies? So it might be confusing. Yes, I want term restrictions, or no, I don't want to extend them, but you might want to. It's pretty confusing. So it's really important that voters come in and have done research, because these ballots only give us so much information. The wording's confusing. We might not even know that certain people are up for election, or certain positions are up for election or re-election. So voters can come on election day and not have everything that they need to vote from the ballot. We're also going to look at propositions. These propositions are citizen initiated. So that means that, or at least this one is, that anybody can go and get a petition and get enough signatures to ask for a ballot measure to be on the ballot. So they're saying, I want to have the voters vote on whether this policy should happen or not happen. And if they get enough signatures for that, then it ends up on the ballot. And then voters have the opportunity to vote yes or no, for or against. So this one, Proposition R, is asking if the city should levy an additional tax, or if they should increase taxes on property in order to raise funds for early childhood services. in St. Louis. So if you wanted to increase funds for early childhood services and you think the best way to do that is through property taxes, then you're going to vote yes. Or if you are not in favor of either the increase in taxes or the increase or increase in child services, early childhood services, you would vote no. So we're not together, but I would like you to take a moment to reflect on some of these questions as we've run through a little bit of the basics of the US election process. How does this information change or reinforce your perception of US democracy and the idea of democracy and the way it's implemented in the United States? And what questions are remaining for you going into this election? We would love to hear this. I'm going to tell you a way that you can not only reflect on it right now, but also share with us at the Gephardt Institute so that we can bring more opportunities to you to learn a little bit more or to engage in conversations, discussions, dialogues with classmates and peers. So, and finally, what are ways that you can continue to engage with the upcoming election? Regardless of whether you can vote, there are certainly ways to get involved, and that this election, even if you can't vote, it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you. There are a number of ways that everyone is impacted by this election, not only as international students, but across the globe in countries you're coming from. They will be impacted by the presidential election and how and what kind of policies that foreign policies that president will take on, and also as folks who are studying in the United States, you are going to be impacted by this election. So what are ways to continue to engage in that and to stay involved? We're going to make some suggestions. I would love to hear yours as well through the session feedback form. Overall, we really, really value feedback, and on our programs, we use these to learn whether we're doing what we're trying to do or how we can improve. So please take a moment. It only takes a couple minutes. You can find the feedback form here, or you can use this QR code and then just go straight to the feedback form. And in there, you can share what you've learned and also share any other questions. And then this next step, some ideas. There's WashU Votes, which is through the Gephardt Institute, and you can volunteer with them on election day to help at the polling location on campus. So there are ways to assist voters on the day and be a part of November 3rd. There's also volunteering to phone bank with a campaign. If you are passionate about a certain candidate, then you can, on any of these elections, on any level, then you can get involved by volunteering your time to that campaign, calling voters, and assisting in those ways. I think that there are, I know there might be concerns about ways that international students can be involved, as long as you are not being paid for your time or donating or from my understanding, being a part of any of major decision making, then you are good to volunteer your time with phone banking with a campaign. And then, as I mentioned earlier, offering your perspective. These issues are, whether or not you can vote, your perspective on the elections are valuable, have importance, and are legitimate. So I really encourage you to offer those in the classrooms with your friends. Encourage your friends who are also international students to get involved. And if you are interested in sharing your story with elections, with political processes, whether in the United States or outside the United States with us, we would love to learn more and be able to use and to be able to share these stories in social media campaigns. So you can email Elizabeth Sally right here. And then finally, we have a debate watch party on October 22nd for the second presidential debate. Please join us virtually to watch the debate and to chat with panelists and with other students and participants. We'll have a channel that is specifically for international students so that we can particularly discuss together some of the issues that are most pertinent. And also you can follow OISS or Gephardt Institute on social media, and there will be great opportunities and information there as well. So again, I point you to our session feedback form, which is right here in the QR code. Thank you so much for joining me today and for tuning in. I hope that you are well. Thank you.